The Indian Struggle Part-5, The Clouds Gathered 1920. The annual session of the Indian National Congress met at Amritsar in Punjab in December 1919, under the shadow of the atrocity perpetrated there earlier in the year. In spite of the opposition of Mr. Chitrandan Das, B.C. Pal and B. Chakravarti, the Bengal leaders, a resolution was passed in favor of working in the new constitution and thanking the Secretary of State for India, Mr. Montagu, who had played an important part in launching it. Mr. Gandhi, who had been largely responsible for the decision, arrived at by Amritsar Congress, welcomed the royal proclamation announcing the assent to the Government of India Act 1919, and in his weekly paper Young India he wrote on December 31st, 1919, the Reforms Act compelled with the proclamation is an earnest of the intention of the British people to do justice to India, and it called to remove the suspicion on that score. Our duty therefore is not to subject the reforms to carping criticism, but to settle down quietly to work so as to make them a success. But during the next 9 months, events moved with dramatic sadness. What actually happened can best be described in the words of Mr. Gandhi himself. When he was tried by British judge Mr. Bloomfield in March 22 for writing seditious articles in his paper, Mr. Gandhi made a remarkable statement in the course of which he explained why, after having cooperated with the British government all his life, he was ultimately forced to turn against it. Therein he said, the first shock came in the shape of a Rowlatt Act, a law designed to rob the people of all real freedom. I felt called upon to lead an intensive agitation against it. Then followed the Punjab horrors, beginning with the massacre at Jallianwala Bagh in Amritsar and culminating in crawling orders, public floggings, and other incredible humiliations. I discovered too that the plighted word of the Prime Minister to the Muslims of India regarding the integrity of Turkey and the holy places of Islam was not likely to be fulfilled. But in spite of the foreboding and the grave warnings of friends at the Amritsar Congress in 1919, I fought for cooperation and working with the Montagu claims for the reforms, hoping the Prime Minister would reform his promise to the Indian Muslims that the Punjab wound would be healed, and that the reforms, inadequate and unsatisfactory though they were, marked a new era of hope in the life of India. But all that hope was shattered. The Khilafat promise was not to be redeemed. The Punjab crime was whitewashed, and most culprits were not only unpunished but remained in service, and some continued to draw rewarded. I saw too that not only did the reforms not mark a change of heart, but they were only a method of further draining India of her wealth and of prolonging her servitude. As already indicated in the section 3rd of the introduction on the New Awakening in India, the new legislation, popularly known as the Rowlatt Act, was enacted on March 18, 1919 for conferring permanently on the Government of India extraordinary powers for the arrest of the individual and their imprisonment without trial when the wartime emergency ordinances leaked in February 1919. Mr. Gandhi started an agitation against the Rowlatt Act bill when it was introduced in the Imperial Legislative Council. In trying to suppress this agitation in the Punjab, incredibly atrocities were perpetrated by the forces of the Crown at Jallianwala Bagh in Amritsar on April 13. There was a massacre of unarmed men, women, and children who had gathered on the occasion of public meeting. This was followed by the reign of terror under martial law, in the course of which many people were publicly flogged, with others were forced to crawl on their bellies when passing along certain streets. Two committees were appointed to inquire into these incidents and submit a report. A non-official committee appointed by Indian National Congress and an official committee appointed by Government of India, the Hunter Committee, the Congress Inquiry Committee, published unimpeachable evidence of the most brutal atrocities committed by the forces of the Crown, including outrages on the helpless women. The findings of the Hunter Committee did not go as far as those of Congress Inquiry Committee. Nevertheless, they were sufficiently damaging for any government. After the publication of these two reports, the public naturally expected that, in view of the new era to be ushered in by the constitutional reforms, the Government of India would take courage in both hands and punish the wrongdoers while granting providing adequate compensation for all those who had been killed or injured or had been otherwise made to suffer. By the middle of 1920, it was clear, however, that the government of India did not purpose to take any such action. The attitude and conduct of the government appeared to the public eye and tantamount to condoning all the inhuman atrocities that had been perpetrated. This created a revulsion of feeling all over the country, even in circles favorably dispersed towards the government of India and the new constitution. There can be little doubt that if the government of Lord Chelmsford, the then Viceroy and Governor General of India, had in 1920 taken drastic action against the authors of the Punjab atrocities, the confirmed cooperator Mr. Gandhi would not have been forced to the path of non-cooperation, nor would have the Indian National Congress have set aside the revolution adopted at Amritsar session in December 1919. Thus, on the rock of Jallianwala Bagh was wrecked the ship of cooperation built by the Secretary of State for India, Mr. Montagu. Though his sympathetic gestures and his elaborate intrigues during his visit to India in 1917 and 1918, it is an open secret that while Mr. Montagu and Chelmsford were touring India with a view to preparing their joint memorandum on the new constitutional reforms, and the former was engaged in rallying public support in favor of working the new constitution. Before he left India in 1918, Mr. Montagu succeeded in definitely winning over the moderate section in the Indian National Congress. When the Indian National Congress met at a special session in Bombay 1918 to consider the Montagu-Chelmsford report, the moderate congressmen, who were then being led by Sir Surendranath Banerjee and Srinivas Shastri, absented themselves, and soon after they separated from the Congress and formed a separate political party under the name of All India Liberal Federation, pledged to work the new reforms. The Special Congress at Bombay in 1918 pronounced the Montagu-Chelmsford report as unacceptable. Nevertheless, in December 1919, the Amritsar Congress resolved to work the constitution drafted on the basis of that report, and also thanked Mr. Montagu. Thus, in spite of all unfortunate events of 1919, Mr. Montagu was able to, though through his personal influence, to keep Congress back from the path of opposition. It was only the government of India's attitude towards the Punjab atrocities that proved to be the proverbial last straw. A British politician in 1934 will naturally inquire why attempts were not made in 1920 to win over the Muslim community, when it was apparent that the Indian National Congress was heading towards the oppositionist policy. On this point, Mr. Montagu was not inactive, and he did his level best to influence the British cabinet, but the odds were against him. During the Great War, Indian Mohammedans had expressed their uneasiness as to what the policy of Britain towards Turkey would be when the time came for discussing peace terms. To placate them, the British Prime Minister, Mr. Lloyd George, had made a conciliatory statement on January 5, 1918, in which he said, among other things, that Great Britain would not pursue a vindictive policy and had no intention of depriving the Turks of the rich lands of Asia Minor and Thrace, which were predominantly Turkish at the end of the war. However, when it was clear that the Allies were aiming at nothing less than the complete disarmament of Turkey, a deputation of Indian Muslims was sent to Europe in March 1920 to plead the cause of the Turks. This deputation, which was led by Maulana Muhammad Ali, the younger of the Ali brothers, failed to achieve anything in spite of the best efforts of Mr. Montagu, the Secretary of State for India. By the middle of 1920, Indian Muslims began to feel that in all probability Turkey would cease to exist as an independent state. The head of the Islamic Church, the Khalifa, who was also the Sultan of Turkey, would be deprived of his territories in Europe and in Asia, and that the holy places of Islam would pass into the non-Muslim hands. The realization of this unavoidable calamity produced a blaze of resentment among every section of the Muslim community in India. But however deep their resentment might be, they were not in a position to take up arms against the victorious British government. Therefore, all they could think of doing was to oppose the working of the new constitution. About the middle of 1920, anti-British feeling was stronger among the Muslims than among the rest of the Indian population. Mr. Montagu had been able to divide the nationalist forces, but he had failed to win over any section of the Muslims, though he had left no stone turned in his efforts to placate them and had ultimately to resign from the cabinet of ventilating their grievances. An organization was set up by the Muslims under the name of All India Khilafat Committee with the objective of restoring to the Khalifa, the head of the Islamic Church, the temporal power which he had enjoyed as a Sultan of Turkey before the Great War. The leadership of this Khalifa movement was assumed by the Ali brothers Maulana Muhammad Ali, the younger but the more influential, and Maulana Shaukat Ali, the elder brother. Both of them were Oxford graduates. Maulana Muhammad Ali had been a journalist and Maulana Shaukat Ali a highly paid officer in excise department of the government of India. During the war, both of them had been interned for carrying on propaganda against the British government and in favor of Turks. The agitation following in the wake of their incarceration had made them prominent in the public eye, and when the Khilafat movement began, it was natural that they should be invested with the crown of leadership. Moreover, their dress and mode of life, shaped according to orthodox Muslim ideas, made a strong appeal to the Muslim masses and served to make them tremendously popular. The Punjab atrocities and their sequel made a rebel of the once loyal Mr. Gandhi. He would had pleaded for cooperation at Amritsar in December 1919 and had succeeded in carrying the Congress with him. Was in 1920 collecting his forces for leading a revolt against the British government. Before he returned to India in 1914, he had tried the method of passive resistance in South Africa in his fight for the rights of Indians against the South African government and had found it extremely helpful. In February 1919, before the Rowlatt Act became law, he had started an agitation on the same lines called the Satyagraha movement against the bills, but the agitation had proved to be absorptive for the time being because of the outbreak of violence. He was, however, fully prepared to use the same method once again in organizing a non-violent revolt against the British government. He had disciplined his body and mind for a life of suffering. He had moreover brought with him a group of loyal followers from South Africa, and during his 6 years stay in India, he won many supporters for his cause. He only wanted more allies in order to be able to capture the leadership of the Indian National Congress. About this time, Ali brothers and the other Muslim leaders were preparing to launch Khilafat movement, and they too were looking out for allies. Nothing could please them more than to find that the premier nationalist organization of the country would take up the cause of Turkey. So an alliance was at the once struck between Mr. Gandhi and Ali brothers on the basis of two issues, with the Punjab atrocities and the Khilafat grievances. The Ali brothers and their followers committee would join the Indian National Congress and agitate attainment of political freedom, which was the only guarantee against such wrongs in future. On the other hand, the Indian National Congress would lend its full support to the Khilafat. Organizations in the country and agitate for the redress of the Khilafat or Turkish grievances. The elections to the legislatures under the new constitution called the Government of India Act 1919 was due in November 1920. The Amritsar Congress had resolved in December 1919 to work this constitution, but in the meantime public opinion had changed considerably. A special session of the Congress was therefore summoned in Calcutta in September 1920 under the presidency of Lala Rajpat Rai, the well-known Punjab leader. Mr. Gandhi was fully aware that his new policy of opposition to the reformed constitution would not be accepted by an influential section in the Congress. He had therefore strengthened himself by an alliance with the Muslim leaders and all the India Khilafat Committee. In fact, he was sure of his position in the country that if the Congress had rejected his plan of non-violent non-cooperation, he could have launched his own campaign with the support of Khilafat organizations. Matters did not, however, come to such a pass. Besides the Muslim leaders, Mr. Gandhi had a powerful ally in Mr. Pandit Motilal Nehru, the leading advocate of Allahabad and the leader of United Provinces, the opposition leading advocate of Calcutta, and the leader of Bengal, Pandit Malviya and Mrs. Besant, both ex-presidents of Congress who had influential support from many provinces. Shortly before the Calcutta Congress, Lokmanya Tilak died. He was the only possible rival of Mr. Gandhi, and at the time of his death, one could not say definitely what attitude he would take up if he were to attend the Calcutta Congress. At the Amritsar Congress, he had taken up a middle position between Mr. Gandhi's proposal of cooperation and B.C. Pal, Mr. B. Chakravarti and Mr. Chintarandan Das proposal of opposition. Lokmanya Tilak held that the proper attitude should be one of responsive cooperation. In other words, the Congress should accept and work what was useful and beneficial in the new constitution and reject what was useless or harmful. The closest followers of Lokmanya Tilak have declared since his death that he adhered to this view till the time of his death. Throughout his public career, Lokmanya Tilak had been the leader of the left wing of Indian National Congress called the extremists and nationalists, as opposed to the right wing called the moderates or liberals. He was a man of profound erudition and unbounded courage and sacrifice. His 6 years incarceration in a far-off Burma prison had brought him additional luster and popularity, and if he had pitted himself against Mr. Gandhi at the Calcutta Congress, the position of the latter would have been a difficult one. With Lokmanya Tilak's death, however, it was smooth sailing for Mr. Gandhi. He moved the adoption of a policy of progressive non-violent non-cooperation, which would begin with the renunciation of the title bestowed by the government and with the triple boycott of legislatures, law courts and educational institutions, and would end in non-payment of taxes. This resolution was carried by a large majority, 1855 votes out of 2728 being in his favor. The resolution of the Special Congress at the Kolkata came up for consideration at the regular annual session held at Nagpur in December 1920. Under the presidency of a veteran Congress leader from Madras, Mr. Vijay Raghavar, Mr. Das and his followers mustered strong Nagpur, hoping to cross swords with Mr. Gandhi once again. But through the latter's tactful handling of the situation, an understanding was arrived at between him and Mr. Das. The boycott of legislatures, to which Mr. Das was chiefly opposed, was no longer a live issue. As the elections had already taken place, it was therefore possible to persuade Mr. Das come to an agreement. When this was done, the non-cooperation resolution was ratified with practical unanimity, though Pandit Malviya, Mrs. Besant, Mr. Jinnah and B.C. Pal remained irreconcilable. Besides ratifying the resolution on progressive non-cooperation, including the boycott of legislatures, lockout and education institutions, the Nagpur Congress took a very important step in altering the constitution of the India National Congress. Hitherto, the goal of the Congress as defined in the constitution had self-government within the British Empire. This had antagonized all those congressmen who believed in the severance of the British connection or who refused to be tied down to the empire. To enable the left-wingers to return to the Congress fold, the goal of the Congress was declared to be Swaraj, which means literally self-rule, and it was left to individual congressmen to define Swaraj in their own way. Mr. Gandhi, however, defined Swaraj to mean self-government within the empire, if possible, and outside if necessary. Before the Nagpur Congress, the machinery of Congress had been a loose one. There were branches only in the big cities, and throughout the year no work was done according to a systematic plan. At Nagpur, it was decided to reorganize the Congress on a country-wide basis. The smallest unit would be the village Congress committee. Several such committees would combine to form a union Congress committee. Then there would be formed in succession subdivisional, district, provincial and all India Congress committees. The All India Congress Committee would be body of about 350 members consisting of representatives from the different provinces. This committee would elect a working committee of 15 members, which would be supreme executive of the Congress for the whole country. Further, the provinces were reorganized on a linguistic basis. For instance, the Madras Presidency was divided into Andhra, which is Telugu speaking, and Tamil Nadu, which is Tamil speaking. The basis of the new Congress constitution was of a democratic and parliamentary character. Besides setting up a new constitution, the Nagpur Congress laid down a definite plan of work for the coming year. Regarding the means to be followed by the Congress for attaining Swaraj, a change was made in the constitution. Hitherto, the Congress had been tied down to constitutional means, but in future the Congress could adopt all peaceful and legitimate means. This change had to be made in order to enable the Congress to resort to non-cooperation, which could be regarded as unconstitutional. Regarding both goal and the means, the decision of the Nagpur Congress represented the golden means between the views of right-wingers like Pandit Malviya and Mr. Jinnah and the youthful left-wingers who swamped the Congress for the first time in 1920. The latter desired the goal of the Congress to be complete independence to be attained by all possible means. It was Mr. Gandhi, however, who by virtue of his tremendous influence and popularity was able to keep the left-wingers at bay. The constitution that was adopted at Nagpur and which holds good even today was practically his own draft. A year before at Amritsar, he had been authorized by the Congress to revise the existing constitution of the body. 1920. Among the other resolutions adopted were those relating to the revival of hand spinning and hand waving, removing of untouchability among the Hindus, and the collection of a fund of 10 million rupees in memory of the late Lokmanya Tilak. While the above resolutions were all of a useful or beneficial character, there was one resolution which must be regarded as a great blunder. That was the decision to wind up the British branch of the Indian National Congress and stop publication of its organ, the paper India. With the carrying into the effect of this resolution, the only center of propaganda which the Congress had outside India was shut down. The Nagpur Congress, like the Calcutta Congress, was a great triumph for Mr. Gandhi. It was his constitution and his plan of work that was adopted there. The gathering was an unprecedented 120,000 people attending the Congress. Public enthusiasm was at a very high pitch, and among the distinguished visitors were two Labour members of the British Parliament, Mr. Ben Spoor and Colonel Wagwood. The Nagpur Congress was an important landmark in the history of Indian nationalist movement. It stood for complete break with the moderates, but it did not represent a complete victory for the extremists. The latter, as we all shall see subsequently, would have to work for many years before they could bring Congress around to their point of view. Considered objectively, the plan which Mr. Gandhi placed before the Congress and country was not something altogether new in the recent history of India. The fight which the people of Bengal had waged against the government as a protest against the partition of their province in 1905 by then Viceroy Lord Curzon had many features in common with the war of non-violent non-cooperation started in 1920. Under the leadership of Mr. Gandhi in 1905, Bengal had resorted to the boycott of British goods and state-owned educational institutions, and there had simultaneously been a revival of national industries and growth of national schools and colleges free from the state interference of every kind. Moreover, leaders like B.C. Pal had refused to give evidence before British law courts on the ground that they refused to recognize their jurisdiction. Sri Aurobindo Ghosh, the leader of extremist section of nationalist movement in Bengal in those days, had compared this policy with the policy of the Irish Siren Féin party. Several decades earlier, the country had witnessed another movement which could also to be regarded as a precursor of Mr. Gandhi, non-cooperation. Before scientists in Europe learned to produce synthetic indigo, Bengal was an important supplier of indigo. The indigo plantation in those days were owned by Britishers, and these foreign landlords were oppressive and brutal in their behavior towards the tenants. When their brutality became unbearable, the tenants of in Jaisur and Nadia took their law into their hands, and they refused to pay rent, stopped cultivating indigo, and made it impossible for the British landlords to live there and terrorize them. Thus, the people had already learned to rid themselves of operation through their own exertion, where they found that the government neglected its duty. It is well-known fact that Mr. Gandhi had in his earlier life been considerably influenced by the teachings of Jesus Christ and ideas of Leo Tolstoy. It cannot therefore be claimed that he was altogether original in his ideas or novel in his patience, but his real merit was a twofold one. He translated the teachings of Christ and ideas of Tolstoy and Thoreau into actual practice and demonstrated that it was possible to fight for liberty without resorting to violence. Firstly, he used non-cooperation not for remedying local grievances but for winning national freedom, and he well nigh demonstrated that it was possible to paralyze the civil administration of a foreign government thereby and bring the government into its knees. A happy combination of factors helped to bring Mr. Gandhi to the forefront in 1920. The attempted revolution during the Great War had failed and the Revolutionary Party had been crushed. There was consequently no possibility of another revolution in 1920. Nevertheless, the country wanted a bold and vigorous policy on the part of the Congress, and the only alternative was a movement like one which Mr. Gandhi started. Secondly, the death of Lokmanya Tilak on the eve of the Kolkata Congress removed from the field the only possible rival of Mr. Gandhi. Thirdly, as a result of his long and careful preparation, Mr. Gandhi was fully prepared to assume the undisputed leadership of the Indian National Congress in 1920. Though ascetic discipline, he had equipped himself for a life of suffering, and during the period of his apprenticeship in Indian politics from 1914 to 1920, he had been able to gather round him a band of loyal and trusted followers. Fourthly, he had acquired experience in the use of the weapon of satyagraha. Though his movement against the Rowlatt Bills in 1919 and proved to be abortive, he had won considerably success in South Africa. Before 1919, he had occasion, moreover, to make use of satyagraha 5 times in India with very good results. Last but not the least, he had gathered around him his had a halo of saintlessness, which was of inestimable value to him in a country where the people revere the sant more than the millionaire or the governor. In spite of the democratic constitution of the Indian National Congress at Nagpur, Mr. Gandhi emerged as a virtual dictator of the Congress. He was moreover spontaneously acclaimed by the people as a Mahatma. That was the highest tribute that the Indian people could give him. Throughout the year 1919, lightning and thunder had raged in the political sky of India, but towards the end of the year, the clouds lifted and the Amritsar Congress seemed to herald an era of peace and quiet. But the promise of Amritsar was not fulfilled. Once again, the clouds began to gather, and towards the end of the 1920, the sky was dark and threatening. With the new year, whirlwind and storm, and the man who was destined to ride the whirlwind and direct storm was Mahatma Gandhi.